Welcome everyone to the second installment of our Spring 2021 Core Conversations series. I am Charlie Thomas. I'm the Executive Director of Actc, the Association for Core Texts and Courses, and we are glad you found us here today. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Dan Cullen, Professor of Political Science and the Humanities at Rhodes College, Senior Fellow for Constitutional Studies at the Jack Miller Center, and a member of the Board of Directors of Actc. I'm going to hand it over to Dan in just a second to give some recorded remarks, or some remarks that you're seeing in a recording right now, I should say. But we will follow this up with a live Q&A on February 19th. So we hope that you will join us and be a part of that conversation. But for now, I'll hand it over to Dan. Thanks for doing this, Dan. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie, and thanks for putting this series together. I'm going to follow the model of my friend Joe Knippenberg and talk about how I approach Rousseau in my own core text program at Rhodes. And the first thing I'll say is that my part of the course is the third semester of a 3-course sequence. And I begin that last semester of the program with Machiavelli. Then we read Shakespeare's Macbeth. That's followed by some selections from Calvin, usually The Christian Life of Self-Denial and On the Right Uses of the Present Life, and a couple of other miscellaneous pieces by Calvin. Then comes Thomas Hobbes, excerpts from Leviathan, pretty much books, chapters 1 to 21. And then Rousseau. And what comes after Rousseau is Adam Smith, John Locke, Marx, Nietzsche, and several other thinkers familiar to all of you and perhaps part of your own curriculum. I just mentioned what comes before and after Rousseau because I teach Rousseau advisedly. In other words, not just in isolation, but how Rousseau might work best in a course such as the one I'm teaching. I've occasionally taught not an entire course on Rousseau, but a course in which Rousseau would be about a third of the syllabus. In this mode, I'm devoting really 3 days, maybe 4 days to Rousseau, and that's probably going to be your experience. I'll say a little bit about why Rousseau in this way by raising the problem of Rousseau. And I mean this in 2 senses. First, what is the problem that arrested Rousseau's attention? What did he set his sights on in his numerous writings? And I think that the discourse on inequality, or the second discourse, its nickname, is the best text for Rousseau's elaboration of what I'll call the human problem, and a problem that he portrays as coeval with the onset of social relations. The work, as you'll see at the end of my remarks, concludes with a striking juxtaposition of the self-possession of what Rousseau calls natural man and the other-directed social or civil man. He says, savage man and civilized man differ so much in their inmost heart and inclinations that what constitutes the supreme happiness of the one would reduce the other to despair. A striking formulation, a striking and disconcerting idea. But there's a second sense of the problem of Rousseau, and that is, why is Rousseau himself a problematic author and philosopher? He described himself once as a man of paradoxes, and that was the mot juste. He's the author of so many diverse and seemingly contradictory works. Is he a Democrat or a totalitarian? That used to be the big question about Rousseau. One could argue he's both and neither, another paradox. So who does Jean-Jacques Rousseau think he is, we might demand? The man of nature, in Hannah Arendt's phrase, the first articulate explorer of the human heart? Or is he the citizen of Geneva, as he liked to portray himself? Or the solitary walker, the theme of his last work? And his next to last book is called Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques. So there's this incredible variety and different self-presentations of Rousseau as an author. All that said, he insisted that his thought was a coherent whole, a system, and I think that that's true. But Rousseau may be the only systematic theorist who doesn't have descendants or disciples in the way that Locke, Kant, Marx, and Hegel do. You know, I've met Lockeans, Kantians, Marxians, Hegelians. I don't really know any Rousseauians in that sense. So it's a bit of a puzzle. So back to the main issue, why read Rousseau in a core text course? And I'm speaking mostly now to those who perhaps haven't read Rousseau or haven't read this particular work, but might be interested in considering him. I'd say his thought causes us to revisit themes that one would find in almost any core text curriculum in all of their variety. The question of what does it mean to be human? What's the relation of individuality and sociality? The relationship of reason and passion, ancient virtue and modern liberty, themes of enlightenment, progress, and the ironies therein. Rousseau is crucial to the development also of early modern natural rights thinking and the idea of political society as arising from contract. He seems to accept the non-teleological science of human nature that one sees in Hobbes and Locke, for instance, in which concentrates our attention, unlike Aristotle, not on the completion or end of humanity, but on its beginnings, its origins. On the other hand, Rousseau is perhaps the first great critic of what we call the bourgeois way of life that's promoted by that philosophical orientation towards origins. He harkens back to the world of ancient virtue, argues that the Enlightenment project of establishing society and the foundation of self-interest rightly understood is a problem. He also seems to prepare the way for the rationalism of Kant and the anti-rationalism that we associate with Romanticism. And he inspires those radical criticisms of social life and civilization as alienating, whether it be Marx, Nietzsche, or Freud. But wait, there's more. His thinking about the malleability of human beings helped usher in the anthropological study of language and culture. Claude Lévi-Strauss, no less, dubbed Rousseau as the father of anthropology, which was not the only paternity suit that Rousseau was involved in. So we face this problem, so many Rousseaus, so little time. And there are many ways to approach Rousseau in a course such as we all teach, or a program that we participate in. As I said, I have 3 or 4 classes, usually at most, to devote to Rousseau, and I tend to use the discourse on inequality. What's it about? Rousseau presents a view of human nature as historical and offers what one might call a new theodicy in which humanity's fall is the result of the development of reason and our diremption from the original condition, from an original condition of pre-rational goodness. Rousseau says that the proposition that guides all his diverse works is that nature made man happy and good, society corrupts him and makes him miserable. That's the human predicament, which many of you will know in another aphoristic rendering by Rousseau at the beginning of The Social Contract. Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. So this human problem is also portrayed in terms of the loss of freedom that was our original or natural condition. And it obviously raises the question, what can be done about it? Our present predicament, Rousseau says, is that we are divided against ourselves. He writes, this is from the beginning of Emile now, swept along in contrary routes by nature and man, forced to divide ourselves between these different impulses, by which he means inclination and duty, we follow a composite impulse, which leads us neither to one goal nor the other, neither to self-fulfillment nor toward the social good. Always in conflict, always floating, Rousseau says, during the whole course of our lives. We never find ourselves or are able to put ourselves in harmony with ourselves. And thus we live in a way, he famously says, in which we are neither good for ourselves nor for others. And I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion of Rousseau in my course, some of these famous and aphoretic statements of Rousseau about his larger question. And then just suggest that we pause and consider, what does it mean to be good for others? We might say, be moral, be virtuous, to use a more old-fashioned term. But do morality and virtue require a sacrifice of self, or should they be understood as a completion of self? And we also have to ask, what does it mean to be good for ourselves? And this is where I like to turn the screw a little bit. How could we not live in such a way as to pursue our good or our happiness? Hobbes's answer to that question is already in the background in my course. And I remind students of Hobbes's point that there's no sunum bonum, as the philosophers used to think of it, but there is a kind of felicity in this life, and we cannot help pursuing it. So what does Rousseau mean that we're not good for ourselves somehow or confused? When we get to the threshold of the discourse on inequality, rather than try to contextualize it per se, I just pose this question. What does it mean to be natural? Sometimes I ask the class, what advice do you give someone who's in a tense state about an upcoming interview, a job interview, or maybe a scholarship interview or some such situation? And it never fails. The answers are just be yourself or act natural, right? I go ahead and experiment with this. And if you don't get those answers, next beer is on me. And I have a little fun with the phrases. I mentioned that when I was growing up, acting natural was what we did when the narcs arrived to do a sweep of the pool hall. It's an interesting phrase, right? But what are we saying when we say things like, well, just act natural? Why is acting necessary? Or just be yourself? If you think about it, the implication is you could be otherwise. and that being oneself cannot be taken for granted, that it's even a kind of achievement. And that invites some attention to the term oneself, which I emphasize, oneself, not two. And reflection on that usually leads to consideration of other terms like spontaneity, authenticity, innocence. And usually somebody will point out that, you know, we're thinking about the way we were when we were children, as we were originally, unself-conscious, freer, less inhibited, and by the way, happier. This sounds, I know, like a scripted discussion, but it really doesn't come about that way. And I think it all, these issues, these terms, these notions crop up, if I may say so, naturally. Students have a lot to say about the phenomenon of being a divided self, or the social mask that we put on. They know all about curating a social image, even as they are caught up in it. And I think they have an impressive awareness of the cost, the psychic cost and the social cost that's part of it. So I usually summarize what's become a 20-minute plus discussion now with a suggestion that our very private self-consciousness might be bound up with our awareness or our imagination and fear that others are evaluating us, and that awareness shapes us decisively, irrevocably. And now we're off to the races with Rousseau, but I've also planted a thought that is going to bear some fruit when we turn to Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments and the idea of spectatorship in another week and a half. So the discourse on inequality begins, it's a highly structured work, a dedicatory letter, an exordium, a preface, 2 parts, a series of notes, which Rousseau says you don't really have to read. They're not important. They're absolutely crucial to read, and you have to insist that students read notes. And we all know they don't like to read footnotes by disposition, but these they have to. But what does he say? His great premise in the beginning is we do not know the nature of man, and that understanding requires a history of the soul, as it were. I mentioned earlier that the great unifying principle of all of Rousseau's writings, he said, was that nature made man happy and good, society depraves him and makes him miserable. The discourse diagnoses what one might call the pathogenesis of sociability. And it does it by means of a conjectural history of the modifications to man's original condition that, in Rousseau's words, make a being evil while making him sociable, and bring the world and mankind, all of us, to the point where we see them. So what he does is he combines psychological and historical analysis, distinguishing between passions that are truly natural or original, and social or acquired or artificial passions. He uses all these terms, and they do take some sorting out. By artificial passions, he means acquisitions that presuppose a departure from an original condition. The artificial passions are those acquired with the expansion of reason and the imagination, to acquisitions themselves that are aggravated by the onset of relations of dependency. because the human faculties don't have any teleological purpose or function, their development isn't directed toward any natural completion. And again, here you could usefully contrast Rousseau with Aristotle. So the historical career of the human being is merely a continuous series of acquisitions that progressively conceal or erode his original form to the detriment of his unity and happiness. Like the statue of the sea god Glaucus, Rousseau says in a beautiful line, which has been disfigured by time and circumstances, the human soul, altered in the bosom of society by 1,000 continually renewed causes, has, so to speak, changed its appearance to the point of being nearly unrecognizable. So that's the challenge. We cannot take Hobbes's view of what human beings are like now as the nature of human beings. So we have to search for the character of natural man, but as he says in another place, natural man has disappeared, never to return. How can we proceed? And that's one reason for Rousseau's hypothetical or conjectural history. So Rousseau emphasizes that the faculties natural man, and by the way, he uses interchangeably the terms l'homme naturel, l'homme sauvage, l'homme originel, and conversely, l'homme social, l'homme civil, l'homme sauvage is another term for original man. And there are some important nuances here, but one doesn't have to go into them, and I certainly won't now. But Rousseau emphasizes that the faculties that natural man possessed in potentiality, which he will later refer to as his perfectibility, which once activated, end up destroying his physical and psychic self-sufficiency, that these faculties developed only by chance, and thus, in principle, natural man might have remained eternally, Rousseau says, in his primitive condition. Who, Rousseau wonders, I'm quoting him now, fails to see that everything seems to remove from savage man the temptations as well as the means to cease being savage. This point, this claim is critical for Rousseau's argument that the existence of natural man was happy and good. Because natural man desires nothing that is not within his present ability to acquire, he says nothing is as tranquil as his soul, and nothing so limited as his mind. The fortunate equilibrium that exists between his abilities, his powers, and his desires makes this solitary existence possible. And it also makes natural man unified within himself. And as Rousseau puts it in another related work, his essay on the origin of languages, in his primitive state, he says, no one knew or desired anything but what was ready to hand. Man's needs, far from drawing him closer to those like himself, draw him away from them. Man in society seeks to expand. Isolated man, l'homme isolé, another variation on the theme of l'homme naturel. Isolated man contracts. So need, for Rousseau, establishes nothing beyond a solitary relation of the individual to nature. That's the suggestion, or at least that's this overt and dramatic suggestion in the argument of the discourse. And then in becoming social, with the onset of social relations, awareness of others. He says, natural man perfects, and he means that term ironically, perfects or expands himself, and as a consequence, forfeits his independence, happiness, and goodness. The social world, then, and the individual who inhabits it must not be mistaken for the original condition or the nature of man. Again, Rousseau distinguishes l'homme naturel and l'homme de l'homme, the man made by man, as it were, the being who is formed and at the same time deformed by sociality, by social relations. The fearful individual described by Hobbes, which Rousseau does not deny, characterizes our present situation, is the one who has become dependent on others for the satisfaction of his needs. But our common interest in self-preservation, rather than our common interest in self-preservation, uniting us in this situation, in this present situation, each of us continues to cling to the spirit of his lost independence, hence the contradiction that Rousseau starts with. This tension between the objective dependence of social man and his subjective desire for independence leaves him in this state of conflict, or to use the fancier term, alienation. Social man's self-love needs the approval of his equally self-centered fellow men, and as a result, Rousseau thinks, we lose the experience of selfhood even as we try to assert it. Arising from an unnaturally fearful response to the problem of self-preservation, civil society ends up destroying the primary sentiment of existence, which Rousseau says makes life sweet. Some of you will know the compelling and wonderful formulation of Alan Bloom's, that according to Rousseau, social man is the man who, when dealing with himself, is the man who, when dealing with others, thinks only of himself. And on the other hand, in his understanding of himself, thinks only of others. That's the essential human problem. So that's Rousseau's story, and he sticks to it in his other writings, but he also thinks of possible solutions to it. Spoiler alert, none of those solutions prove to be satisfactory. I've been going on for a while now, so I think I'll stop. And just to whet your appetite, if you don't know the discourse on inequality, I'll leave you with the conclusion of it. This is Rousseau speaking. In thus discovering and retracing the forgotten and lost paths that must have led man from the natural state to the civil state, in restoring, in addition to the intermediary stages I have just indicated, those which the pressure of time made me omit or the imagination failed to suggest to me, any attentive reader cannot but be struck by the immense distance that separates these two states. He will sense that since the human race of one age is not the human race of another age. He will sense that the human race of one age is not the human race of another age. He will explain how the human soul and passions, by imperceptible adulterations, so to speak, change in nature. Why in the long run the object of our needs and of our pleasures change. Why, as original man gradually vanishes, society no longer offers to the eyes of the wise man anything but an assemblage of artificial men and factious passions, which are the product of all these new relationships and have no true foundation in nature. Observation fully confirms what reflection teaches us on this subject. And here's the line I mentioned earlier. Savage man and civilized man differ so much in their inmost heart and inclinations that what constitutes the supreme happiness of the one would reduce the other to despair. The first breathes nothing but repose and freedom. By contrast, the citizen, forever active, sweats, scurries, constantly agonizes in search of ever more strenuous occupations. He works to the death, even rushes toward it in order to be in a position to live, or renounces life in order to acquire immortality. The genuine cause of all these differences, the savage lives within himself. Sociable man, always outside himself, is capable of living only in the opinion of others, and so to speak, derives the sentiment of his own existence solely from their judgment. Years ago, I used to mention to my class I asked if anybody knew what the motto of Club Med was. Club Med was popular about 20 years ago. It may still be going, I don't know, but nobody remembers the motto now. They had a commercial whose jingle was "The Club Med Vacation, the antidote for civilization." And it's a great question to ask. Why does civilization need an antidote? I think that's a good way to proceed to Rousseau.
Thanks, Dan. I am, what I want is just to come to Memphis and sit in on your Rousseau seminar, but I'm glad at least we get a chance to talk together in February 19th. But I would like to ask one question.
Sure.
You already said that would be okay. Yeah, good. You know, it's a big one. This was really fantastic. It really brought some things together for me. I confess I'm one of those who has a hard time seeing the unity. And I've read a lot of Rousseau, not a Rousseau scholar, but
yeah. Well, I think you are, Charlie, but
well,
you can play that game.
I play that on TV. You know, I was really thinking about Montaigne, just to sort of take us on a side track here for a second, that I know you can go on with me. And the way that Montaigne seems to and of course Rousseau knew Montaigne well, and I think there's a lot of Montaigne in Rousseau. You know, famously, Montaigne's essays will often begin with a claim that pushes in one direction, and by the end, they seem to be pushing in the opposite direction. And Montaigne is very aware of this. And in fact, you know, you always have to read between the lines and between the essays for Montaigne, but you get to the point where this seems to be an important part of the project, a sort of an exercise in honesty. That is something other than self-consistency or a kind of a series of claims that don't contradict each other. That shouldn't be this. By implication, it seems to me that Montaigne is saying that's not what honesty is. Honesty is sort of a kind of a transparency to oneself and to the world in any given moment, even if that presents things that are contradictory to how one, you know, presented oneself in another moment. And this sort of it made me wonder if something like that can come and help me, and you already have, with why Rousseau really can be presenting something whole and at the same time be presenting something that appears to push in so many different directions. And so the question here is, to kind of, with apologies to Jacques Ellul, are there any Rousseauian answers to Rousseauian problems, right? That is Montaigne actually, I think, and everything in Montaigne is speculative, but I think Montaigne actually thinks that this is a way, this of approaching perhaps self-knowledge or pursuing a kind of more honest, maybe natural, I mean, this is a harder word, I think, way of being in the world. Does Rousseau, you think, in this sort of acknowledgement of the deep conflict, the deep sort of bifurcation, probably is too simple, but these divisions within human nature, that somehow by displaying them, we get into other problematic parts of Rousseau's autobiography, but in sort of displaying oneself to the world and not avoiding those apparent contradictions, not avoiding those apparent tensions, that in effect has a kind of salutary effect. Is this a way, because I think Montaigne is saying this is a way to live. This is not the only way to live, but this is a way to live. It's coherent, it has dignity. Is in a sense Rousseau offering anything like that?
Wow, what a question. Honestly, I'm not sure, and I'm not saying that just to dodge it, but I've recently been trying to answer it in a couple of essays that. A couple of new essays on Rousseau I've worked on. I'd say a couple of things. Rousseau's works are always highly rhetorical and addressed to a particular situation. I think I mentioned earlier on that I believe he does think there is a human problem, an essential human problem, and that it has to do with what one might call the life according to nature. I think that nature remains a standard for Rousseau, even though its status is very difficult to account for, but he just keeps coming back to it over and over again. But what we see in the variety of writings that he presents to us is, as I mentioned, almost experiments at trying to imagine the way in which human wholeness might be restored. He takes for granted that it's broken, that there's a diremption. But if there is such a thing as nature, and if there is such a thing as human happiness, then one imagines there ought to be some form of wholeness that corresponds to it. And yet it seems time after time, all of those efforts, those attempts to construct a view of being a non-alienated human being happy and free in the mode of natural man, but on now what we might call a higher plane, or on the truly human plane. Each one of those Rousseau seems to investigate thoroughly and seriously, and yet ultimately reveals all the contradictions. So in a way, here's another paradox. He's such an artful, careful writer who is aware of the power of his words and knows how to evoke certain responses. On the other hand, he shows all the problems at the same time. You know, he shows his work. And that's very true, I think, in the social contract. From the presentation of a social contract in book 1, chapter 6, then to a second understanding of how society will be founded in book 2. And that happens all the time. So where is Rousseau finally? I think the decisive work is the Reveries of the Solitary Walker, Rousseau's last work, also highly rhetorical, evoking the theme right at the beginning and at the very end of Solitude à la Montaigne. And it's both, on the one hand, a pose, because Rousseau isn't living a solitary life. But the first line of the book is "Me voici donc seul sur la terre." Here I am alone in the world. What is he trying to investigate with this reflection on solitude? He recovers again the theme of nature and happiness and freedom. It all comes up in the book. Where I'm left, and I think this does get back to your original question, I would just turn it in this direction. Is Rousseau ultimately living and defending what we might call the philosophic life? Is that a possibility for him? Is it a possibility for not everyone, but for rare individuals? Or is it the case that where Rousseau ultimately finds his greatest satisfaction, greatest unity, greatest selfhood, is in an experience that is not rational and not really reflective? This, I think, is a difficult and even grueling question in the Reveries. And as you know, there are scholars who have strong opinions about this both ways. I've tended toward the view that ultimately Rousseau doesn't have a persuasive case for the philosophic life, in part because the idea of nature itself has been exploded in his own account, and I don't see the ultimate coherence of it. But Rousseau certainly writes in a way as to suggest that it remains possible and even invites to it. But I remain ambivalent about it. I just don't understand it yet, and don't understand Rousseau well enough to say so. But I could recommend people who do. Another thing I'd just say in closing about Rousseau and Montaigne is that Rousseau may have taken some things in Montaigne both more literally and more seriously than Montaigne did, and I'm thinking especially of what he has to say about the cannibals and their way of life. I know
we're gonna have to end this. We're gonna have to end this discussion with of cannibals. Just yeah. I guess that's what we do, though. We set the table and we invite folks to come. I guarantee you, if the queue has any openings in it at all, I will be bringing us back to of cannibals on the morning of February 19th. But for now, I do think. Sadly, we have to bring this to the close. That was really excellent, and I appreciate you doing this. Thank you so much, Dan.
Good to be with you.
And please join us on February 19th and join the conversation with Dan and me about the problem of Rousseau. Thanks for joining us. Also, the ACTC conference registration is open. We'll be meeting online April 12th through 16th, and we'd love you to be a part of that as well. So please check us out at coretexts.org. Take care.